You might have even had to pretend to be straight at certain points in your life, right? So the idea here is that because you experience both your own oppression and are forced to see the default heteronormative expectations, you have this double vision, right? You're able to see things through both lenses, and so you have greater epistemic privilege. And so you can take this example and expand it out to any other of the intersectional identities, right? So if you are a man, right, if you're socialized as a man, a cisgendered man, you, according to this theory, would know less about, say, gender inequality, since that has targeted historically women, right? And then women would thus know more about gender inequality as the subjects of that marginalization. Now, the important thing about this is that this is not a priori knowledge, right? It doesn't just come because you have a certain identity. And not only does it only come through your experiences, but more importantly, it can only come through a resistance to that oppression. So if a woman were to have internalized the oppression that she has experienced in the world, right? Messages that she should be submissive, right, to men, that she should only exist in the home as a mother or wife, right, that she has no value outside of that. If she has internalized those messages and not resisted them, she would then not have that epistemic privilege, right? So again, we can think back to realistic examples of how this comes into impact our lives. So if you remember back when the Senate was, debating whether or not the Affordable Care Act should cover birth control. Well, as you know, most birth control is targeted towards females, right? So we have very few, male forms of birth control outside of prophylactics. And so the onus historically has been on women, right? And specifically the effects have predominantly targeted women, right, and their bodies. So when you look at the Senate's hearings when they're debating whether or not birth control should be covered under the Affordable Care Act, it's not an accident that that panel was composed of entirely white men, right? There was not a single woman on that forum that could contribute to the conversation of whether or not birth control should be covered. And then the one woman who did speak up, she happened to be in the audience, and she asked a question, was then later berated, right, for being a slut, right? The only reason she could possibly want birth control is so that she could go and sleep with a bunch of people, right, and not get pregnant, and horrible, all of the horrible, right, anti-female, misogynistic things we've come to be familiar with, right? But the idea is that not only should women have been represented, but they probably should have been primarily represented, since they are the ones who are primarily affected by this, right?